Hello and welcome to another episode of Hooper's Beta. Today we're shooting an episode here at my home wall where I typically train and do all that kind of jazz. We're going to be talking about a method of fingerboarding that I just call mixed hangs. This is a method that is fairly simple, requires nothing other than a single fingerboard, and can accommodate people of all levels from most of the newest beginners to depending on what exact kind of fingerboard you have, people up to a World Cup level.
By the way, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, the only website building platform we use.
So, why would I use mixed hangs as opposed to symmetrical hangs as they're so common? They offer a couple of benefits for climbers at different levels. With symmetrical hangs, whether it's one-arm or two-armed, you very quickly have to start adding weight to maintain the right difficulty level. Whether that's reducing weight with the pulley or increasing weight with the harness, some moderation of load is necessary in order to keep making things harder. With mixed hangs, you simply choose a worse sort of like working hold or a worse assistant hold. There are a whole lot of options as to how to do this with any given fingerboard, ranging from increasingly bad slopers to smaller edges to fewer fingers on sort of pocket type grips. Beyond this, for newer climbers, it gives you a much more realistic imitation of the experience that you're going to have on the wall, because very rarely, even at your first day in the gym climbing, you're typically not matched on a uniform hold. You're almost always transitioning from one hold to another, you're biasing one side, and you're moving in a generally asymmetric fashion. So by using holds of different qualities and getting into the habit of shifting your shoulders and biasing a single hold, it's going to have somewhat better carryover to the climbing that you're going to be doing, as well as getting you sort of prepared at an early stage for one-arm hangs. For more advanced climbers, it's really useful because it lets you work on smaller edges than you'd be able to hang with one hand generally, while also sort of focusing on weaker grip positions. So for myself, I've had some finger tweaks over the years and I really don't like pockets. And so it's pretty easy for me to basically pick a hold that is a little bit too small for me to hang one-handed and assist it with either like pocket strings on a bad edge or possibly crimping a very small hold to build skin for the future. So in many ways, this really is a fairly straightforward approach to fingerboarding and grip training as a whole, but it's really quite powerful. You can take somebody who's essentially a brand new climber and hang from more or less jugs, getting them more acclimated to hangboarding as well as just dangling from their fingers as a whole, and use it to progress all the way to a world-class level just using a standard fingerboard. By the time that you can do sort of 3-finger hangs on the small beastmaker edges, you're probably going to be climbing pretty hard. All right, so it's very important with this method to really understand and prioritize the working hand. If you hang completely straight and symmetric between these hands, regardless of whether it's a dangle or a lock off or whatever, you're going to be inclined to try to weight the hands evenly. That's very much not what we're trying to do here. And so the easiest way to avoid that is to just rotate and look at the working hand. This is going to get you into a stronger, kind of more preferable scapular plane, and it's going to make you very intentionally weight the target hand and not so much the assistant's hand. There is a little bit of auto-regulation going on, by which I mean you can try to simply load your main hand, your working hand, as much as possible by intentionally grabbing the offhand as little as possible. That's great. You should probably do that in general. You'll find that as you start to fatigue, you load the assisting hand a bit more. That's also okay. It's going to let you hit your target times. Okay, so for the first couple of sessions, you're just going to kind of play with the different hold combinations, starting with relatively big holds, and as you warm up, working down to smaller and smaller holds, until you find 1 or 2 grip combinations that are both comfortable and produce failure in the sort of 4-second range. So, as an example, I would want to start with sort of a 20 mil and like one of the big outside edges. And I find that this is pretty easy. You know, I can hang out here, kind of take my time. There's no real risk of failure here, but it gets me a little warmed up. I can kind of move around and weight my hands and kind of see how things feel. Rust a little bit, of course. But you sort of keep wandering down, try sort of the medium edge and the small outside edge. This is starting to feel a little bit engaged, but it's still fairly easy. So we start kind of trying to find worse and worse combinations. This is accelerated a little bit for demonstration purposes. Normally you would want to take a full sort of 6 to 10 seconds just to make sure. But you want to keep trying things until you find something that is too much. And that'll give you kind of a center to start working around. After that time, you'll have a pretty good understanding of what sort of hold sizes and grip combinations are challenging for you. In this case, by challenging, we're looking for something that is causing failure in the sort of 4 to 10 second range. Less than that is just hard to program with, hard to get good progress, and conceivably could be somewhat risky. Beyond 10 seconds is just not really hard enough. You could do something that's a little more endurance-based, like repeaters or something. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's also going to be a little bit unpredictable, and it's probably not going to progress as fast as you'd like. So find some hangs in the sort of 4 to 10 second range, and then we start trying to build volume.
Don't you wish starting your online business didn't require a bunch of extra equipment either? With Squarespace, you can launch your very own website and online shopping platform all in one with no programming experience or complicated add-ons needed. We particularly love the ability to create long, in-depth blog posts, including links to the YouTube video. That way you can read along at your own pace as needed. I also love the analytics, especially when we can look at different information such as geography. That way we can see where everyone's viewing from, including the 24 loyal fans from Peru. Finally, I love with the scheduling feature that not only can patients easily book appointments with me as needed, but there's also tons of integrations that come with it, including Intuit QuickBooks and Zoom. That way patients can schedule appointments quickly and easily, and it takes a lot less work for me to get everything organized. So make sure you go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/HoopersBeta to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
Now that we've found a combination of grips that we like and are reasonably challenging, we have to think about how we want to lay out our workouts and how we want to progress them over time. There are, of course, a number of different ways to do this, but I think the following method works really pretty well while being fairly simple and easy to put into action. Because we don't want to be constantly changing hold types, and because there's typically a significant change in difficulty when you do, it's going to be easiest and most reliable for us to play with sets and reps. Let's imagine that I've played around with this a little bit and I've found a good combination of holds that work well. I find it to be challenging, but I'm able to confidently and consistently use this pair of holds from session to session. Initially, I'm only able to hold them for 5 or 6 seconds, and I realize that if I hang them for 5 or 6 seconds, I get tired really fast and I'm not able to do too many sets. So what I want to do is dial back the time just a little bit, so I'm not going completely to failure for most of the sets. It's fine if the last set or two you do. But I'm going to try to work up to, as a useful guideline, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 seconds of total time under tension for each working hand over the course of my session. By the time that I get to that 30 seconds, I should feel pretty acclimated to this grip, and it should at least not feel so limit for me. How are we going to make it harder from there? Basically, you're going to try to maintain that amount of time under tension, roughly 30 seconds, but you're going to reduce the number of sets that it takes to get there. Over time, you should be able to condense these sets fewer and fewer until you're at 3 or 4 sets of kind of 10 seconds. And at that point, you should feel really pretty solid on the hold and ready to start exploring some harder hold combinations. You could even go up to sort of 6 sets of 10 seconds in a relatively extreme case, but by the time you're doing several sets of 10-second hangs, you can almost certainly drop a finger or go to like a slightly smaller edge size. At that point, I'm going to feel around a little bit to find another grip combination that's a little bit harder. This is frequently sort of obvious, but it may take a little bit of feeling to see which pair of holds is going to work best for you. As an example from here, if I'm finding that sort of 2 fingers on the small edges and 4 fingers on the medium edge is working pretty well, I don't want to go down to a mono. I personally find that this is unnecessarily tweaky relative to its merit. If you climb somewhere like the Franken-Euro and you're very experienced with pockets, get after it. But for most people, I don't think it's really worth the risk. So what I would probably do is drop down to a smaller edge size, like the outside edges here, and then go 2 or 3 fingers as needed on the other outside edge, retest my max time, and kind of keep building from there. Okay, now that we've gone over how you employ this method in general, I have a couple of pieces of advice to kind of help you make the most of your time going forward. The first one is that one of the merits of this workout is that it's very quick and efficient, and it requires very few extras. So if you're somebody who just doesn't want to or isn't able to spend a ton of time training, it's really efficient to do your pull-ups, which are now going to be essentially assisted one-arm pull-ups, at the same time as your fingerboarding. This isn't going to work as well if your pulling strength and your grip strength are vastly different, but as long as they're loosely similar, it should be a very effective way to train your vertical pulling at the same time as your hands. If you want to be really efficient with it, It's very possible to do your push work as well as, you know, some legs or flexibility training in the rest periods between hangs. Then you get your entire workout out of the way in like 30 minutes. Another thing you may be wondering is how often you should do this. This approach should be considered pretty interchangeable with fingerboarding as a whole, and thus sort of 2 or 3 days a week should work really well for most people. If you're a more experienced climber, I think 3 is very much the right number, but 2 would be okay. One sort of additional thing that I really like about these mixed hangs is it lets me control a lot better how much skin damage I want. When you're using symmetrical holds, you're sort of stuck with whatever hold size it is that you're trying to train on. And if you add more weight or basically try harder on smaller edges, you're kind of just stuck with however much abrasion, rolling, tearing you're gonna get. But if it's in the summer like it is now, and I really want to minimize skin damage so that I can climb as much as possible, I can hang a somewhat larger edge and assist with something that's like a slopey pocket or like the Beastmaker 45 or something like that. And it really shouldn't bother my fingers all that much. Conversely, if I'm trying to get ready for the fall out in Bishop, I can use a smaller hand for my sort of like working hold, and I can assist with something like a 3 or 4 mil edge or something like that, and intentionally try to really grab it to build callus for those smaller edges. So it's not that it necessarily has to be more skin friendly, but it lets you sort of choose how skin friendly or not you want it to be, which I find to be quite useful. If you find that your previous grip is too easy and the next grip combination is too hard, which is unfortunately something that can happen with this method, I find that a way to essentially break in a new grip that works really well if it's just a little bit too hard is to do cluster sets. These can be eccentrics where you're kind of jumping and lowering out as slow as possible, or even just very short isometric holds where you can hang the grips but only for maybe 1 or 2 seconds. So I would grab a hold that is harder than what I'm currently using, and in this case it assumes that it's even a little bit too hard. And I would try to kind of hop into it and just hang for a little bit. You can do a couple sets of these. Alternating between hands and building up sort of time and again, confidence with those grips until you're ultimately able to do longer hang times and move back into a standard protocol. And the final tip is that this really shouldn't get overly complicated. The goal is simply to find something that's relatively difficult, do more of it, and then smush it together so that the hangs are essentially longer and more challenging that way. It's kind of hard to go wrong with as long as you have an eye towards improving and generally trying to do more from session to session.